Thanks very much, everybody. I'm Sharon Constançon. I'm chairman. No, I'm not. I lie. I'm CEO of Genius Methods. I forget which hat I'm wearing at the moment. CEO of Genius Methods and CEO of Genius Boards. I do happen to be the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce, which is where I normally spend my time in webinars. It's in that space. So I just wanted to welcome everybody here today who have arrived and are part of our little get-together. This is a roundtable style discussion rather than a webinar, so you are all visible, we can interact with one another. And the idea is I'll spend about 15-20 minutes talking about culture, which I've had to break up into 3 different sessions because the topic is so massive, and however much I'm good at rushing, this is a South African capability, I'm not going to rush through all of culture in 15-20 minutes. So thanks very much. All right, what we're going to talk about today is board culture. And please, at any point in time, if there's something you desperately want to talk about and not wait the 15 minutes, you can put your hand up. I may or may not respond, depending on how we're trying to get through the topic. Culture is that thing that you can't see and you can't touch, but you can feel. It's the way we do it here. They talk about tone from the top is another way of talking about culture. But everybody in an organization is responsible for culture. It is the outcome of everybody as they are working together. It's a systemic part of an organization. Behaviors in an organization are in response to the culture. I was having a very long conversation with the chairman of an organization today, 3 hours. I've just got off the call. And we were talking about the behaviors of board directors as a result of a culture change that has occurred in their boardroom environment, and what to do about that and how to resurrect that culture back to something that is effective and deliverable. So it really is something that inherently changes in tiny little steps for the better or for the worse. And it's only when you sit back and do some self-reflection do you actually say, hold on, the culture doesn't feel right anymore. This is not the way it should be working. Now, culture is anything. When we talk about culture, sometimes people talk about culture from the perspective of a country, or we talk about it from the perspective of a industry or of a profession. So there are all sorts of ways in which we can talk about culture. But what we're talking about here is how culture works in the boardroom. And the important part for culture, the reason why it's important that culture works is to deliver the strategy. You cannot deliver strategy in an inappropriate culture environment to that organization. So therefore, your culture is partly your brand. So what is it that you look like to other people? How do you work here? If you walked into a top 5 legal firm, or you walked into a communications consultant or an advertising organization, you would know which company you had walked into. There'd be no doubt in your mind as to where you are. You can feel it, you can see it. It is the way they present themselves to the world. And it's equally, therefore, the way they choose as a brand and as an organization to interact with all stakeholders. So that might be the investors, that might be the staff, it might be the customer, it might be the supplier, and all the other stakeholders, regulators, and everyone else you can include in that stakeholder game. How do they behave? So you can imagine a building society talking to the regulator and Barclays talking to the regulator, same regulator, same rules, but the way they are going to interact is going to be different. Culture is also about what we tolerate. An organization that allows a director or a chief exec or staff members to behave badly, not pull their weight or to come in late or to be lazy, whatever it might be, that actually becomes part of your culture as well. And it also defines the way people politically work within that organization. Now, if you look at a government, small p, and that politics that occur behind the scenes, and you look at an SME and the politics that occur behind the scenes, you are going to have a very different political behavior as well as the way people will get heard, seen, recognized, and ultimately how they make sure they behave such that they are promoted, paid, and incentivized. And also it's the physical. So what does the building look like? What does the offices look like? All of those are part of culture as well. The leaders of culture within the workplace environment is the chairman and the CEO. This is where you see most of it, but you equally see every department head being a contributor towards culture. And one of the things you've got to ensure is that that culture is led up from the bottom at the same focus as it is desired at the top. Now, quite often you get what we call a governance gap, where there's an intention at the top, but a delivery by general management in an organization or middle management that doesn't necessarily correlate. So there are other influences within the management environment that can support this, and your company secretary, senior independent director are key people from the board level, but equally from management level, you've got the whole chain of command within the business, and you've got the various different people, cogs in the wheel, as we will call them, as the way people operate. We need to recognize that culture is present. And if you look at some of the examples that I've pulled together here, is the values stated by the organization will always be a grounded, deep-rooted values, respect, integrity, service, excellence, and stewardship. And if you look back to the way Barclays behaved in the early 2000s, I don't think everyone would be comfortable as customer or as supplier or as stakeholder to Barclays, or those that worked within the investment bank part of Barclays would necessarily say that the senior management ethics and drive was aligned to the Barclays Code of Conduct. So it's important that what you write and what you do are correlated. And you need to sit down on a routine basis as a board and correlate, are you actually doing that? Is there a connection between what you state your values and your code of conduct are and the way the people in your organization are behaving? Or are you giving them latitudes that you shouldn't be giving them, and therefore you're giving them the right to misbehave and to not follow the total orthodox of the organization? And this is where we had a situation with Bob Diamond, who actually put on record saying culture is what happens in the organization when nobody is looking. I think he should have remembered he'd said that, because that's quite key to the ethics of the individuals who are saying it and the way we're getting on with doing the business. If you look at the BP example, the culture under the CEO at the time, who was the one who said, I need to get my life back. You then had a short-sightedness in the business where they were focused on the bottom line, they were focused on cost cutting, they were focused on the delivery and the profitability and the growth, but not necessarily focused on the sustainability of some of the projects they were on. They were lacking in health and safety, they were lacking in maintenance, and that became a culture of the organization. And interestingly enough, within my Chartered Director program, we actually picked up BP as a case study in 2007 and did an exercise on when did we think BP would have their next major global disaster, because they had a couple before, and some of them felt that this could be predicted by their behavior. And as a management group of chartered directors at the IOD, we actually pulled together this exercise and claimed it would happen within the next 10. There would be a major disaster potentially within the next 5. And actually, in reality, it happened 2 years later. So it's interesting. You can actually invariably, when there's been a big event, you can look back and you can say, I can actually see the pivotal moment. I can see the aspect or the activity or the behavior or the change that prompted things to go so horribly wrong. Another way of recognizing culture, if you look at the Bank of England, for example, you look at that building, that tells you everything about the culture of Bank of England. And they described it in a board evaluation that was done quite a while back, 10 years ago or so, saying it's centralized, hierarchical, deferential, filtered. So it's what hope had the board got of running that organization in a way that was getting transparent information, that they were entrepreneurial in their thinking, that they were doing what was best for the economy and the bank and us as taxpayers of the society, of the country. So by being centralized and filtered, information was never reaching the board. But equally being hierarchical, people were keeping information to themselves, but equally the decision-making process had to go through so many layers that everything took so long to happen. And everyone worked out what the mechanism was, is you don't tell them this, but you tell them that and you get it approved. So it created a very slow culture and a very slow learning environment and slow to innovate. So that is, for example, the culture of the Bank of England. I've not read a more recent assessment, so I think I must go in there and do it, and then I'll come back and tell you what it's like. Some other examples that I'd like to share with you is a FTSE 250 I've worked with, where we had a very good chairman and a very good senior independent director, both of them very skilled in their capabilities, both with high EQ, high ability to communicate, and walked the talk very successfully as individuals. And they worked very strongly as a team with a very competent company secretary in this case, and they handled the coronavirus chaos of last year extremely competently in a very high heavy engineering manufacturing environment that they were based in. So they work together as a team, they walk the talk of their culture, and they deliver, which was very rewarding to see. I've seen a case where we've seen a change in a chairman, and the organization literally does not look like the one it was before. The FTSE 250 changes the chairman, the whole board changes, the behavior of the board changes, the way meetings are held, the content of meetings, the focus, the ethics, the drive, the relationship with the CEO. Everything changes when you change a CEO or a chairman. In this case, I'm giving an example of a chairman change. And the way that then filters into the business as to how the business then filters that into successfully delivering to all stakeholders. Then you have another example, equally of FTSE 250. I thought I'd take them all in at the same group, so I didn't feel like I was victimizing any group of companies, where you had both an ineffective chairman and an ineffective SID. Now, this was a circumstance where the saying in the business was that the chairman should join the 21st century, which says everything in that style. Other comments were he's cemented into the 1950s. So you had that very old style approach towards being a chairman of an organization and driving it forward from the chair, giving that direction and leadership of the organization, being a mentor to the CEO. And in this particular case, we were doing the review of the chairman, and I was working with the SID, so I had done the exercise and now shared it with SID, who wanted to see it first before we chatted to the chairman. He says, under no circumstances am I repeating any of this to the chairman. So, this is the review, this is the outcome, this is what we need to discuss. He says, I know all of this, but I'm not going to say that. I'm refusing. You can go and talk to the chairman. I'm not doing that because he's the chairman. And because he's the chairman, I can't tell him the truth, basically, is what he was telling me. It's a FTSE 250 company where an individual is not able to perform their role because of the hierarchy within the organization and within his culture and the way he works. We see very different cultures in family businesses, regulated entities, charities, SME, a startup versus the cash cow organization, a professional firm, government, public sector. I'm working with an organization at the moment that is partly linked to government and is actually very innovative in the private sector. And trying to balance these challenges at the board level is unbelievably difficult because the mindset and the experience and the way business is considered is just so dramatically different. So what have we learned in 15 minutes, which I said I would try and keep to? You can't see culture. You can sense culture. You can see the outcome. You can see the impact of culture very much. There's no doubt about that. And culture and change in culture is far more successfully noted in retrospect than it is in looking forward at it, and seeing it in the moment. It is very difficult for a chairman or a collective board to recognize how their culture looks to the outside world. The value of a board evaluation where you put the mirror up and say, that is actually what you look like. And they think, oh, really? It's not what I thought it was. this is just a little bite into corporate culture and the way it impacts the way a board behaves. Now, our next two sessions are going to cover the good and the bad, what a healthy culture looks like, what a bad culture looks like, some of the things that are the outcomes as a result of that. And then we will look at when companies focus on certain things, whether they're a performance culture or whether they're an ethical culture, and how that drives the decision making within the organization and the types of non-executive directors and board directors they pull together, and the way that board works with the executive. So there's my South African rush through our first little bite of 3 at culture. Now, I'm happy to go back to any of the points that we have covered and ask any questions, listen to any input from all of us. We've got another 20 minutes or so to just run over our half hour to get some contribution from our colleagues. So maybe I'd like to ask the question of any of you, and Alan, maybe I can put you in a slightly difficult position because I can see you. Actually, I can do this to Brian as well. Brian, do you want to think too? Brian Foss is an example where you have seen culture in an organization either be disruptive or be a positive move for change. Anybody got some examples? Anybody else want to put a hand up and give us an example of their experience?
This is a highly entrepreneurial organization, a big startup, if you like, that never made the transition between a really dictatorial outlook and a participative outlook. So what happened was that the chief executive was clearly very comfortable with silos so that they could control each aspect of the business individually. The board was ineffective, about 12 people on the board and 3 opinions effectively in the meeting. And eventually the company, which is by now quite large, about 4,000 people, just ran into the ground. It became operationally so inefficient that they ran out of cash.
Another example I've seen that comes to mind at the moment, and this is something you probably see in the US more predominantly than you might see in the UK because of our natural English culture, is people taking on CEO or chairman roles, and they are, if anyone's read the book Snakes in Suits, where somebody is on the autistic spectrum and you have to try and work with that as a leadership culture within an organization, which ends up in the highest degree of divide and rule and control. And Alan, you prompted me about people wanting to have their controlled silos. So some people can only be comfortable if they've disrupted everything, and that gives them the control environment that they are then working in. And sometimes it is a personality, genuine personality disorder that you're dealing with, not just a person who has a personal agenda that delivers that play of behavior. Brian, is there something you'd like to share with us, or did I catch you off guards too much?
No, I've always got something to throw in, Sharon. You
say.
There are some really good examples. I'm working with lots of early stage growth companies, which are great. But let me just list a couple of the worst things I've seen, just to be at the other end of the spectrum. So I've seen behaviors including bullying,
plenty of it.
Exclusion, shutting down of people, swearing in board meetings. Often I find that boards that act like this don't really have a code of conduct, so it's quite hard to point at something and say that's wrong, because the board may have got into these behaviors over time.
And they'd be seen as being deemed acceptable.
Yep. So how do you draw a line and say that's not a standard we're going to work to? Often these things can be aimed at directors, even non-executive directors, that are supporting minorities. So minority investors, employees, other partners, where they're standing out against crowdthink and against the flow. and that can take you towards resignations or towards some form of whistleblowing, which in turn can put the individual under even more personal pressure, financial, personal, reputational. Yeah, so I've just chosen to pick on some of the worst things that can happen and direct you over there, but I'm sure I've got equally as many really good things.
I had a circumstance where a director got so upset with information that didn't suit the individual that the thumping of his fist on his glass boardroom table honestly made me think it was going to go and it was going to not survive it. And then I came to the conclusion this is probably not the first time he's done it, and the table is still here. So maybe the table is stronger than he is. But the swearing and bullying that you see in business is frightful. The diversity issue and the lack of inclusion that you talk about is rife. Anybody else want to share a story or a fact or anything with us?
Sharon?
Yes.
Yes, Stuart. Yeah, it's interesting through the whole series of these talks so far how much there's a correlation between a person's personality and how they behave.
Yeah.
And that must be a real challenge because it's not easy to change your personality. And if you're particularly authoritarian or egotistical, I would imagine ego is one of the biggest problems that you come
Personal
across, where
agenda
people
comes
are,
with it.
right, where people are affronted by criticism or affronted by a challenge, then that would by itself create quite an unhealthy culture. I just wondered if you could comment on that.
Yeah, we've got an example I'm working with where if a person is criticized, constructively requesting them to toe the ordinary social norms lines of the way a director should behave in a boardroom, and their reaction was, you could only say wired to be a reaction that was so vicious to the person who was their chairman, working with them to support, mentoring them to understand how to work within the team effectively. And that person's reaction has absolutely, completely undermined the entire operation of the board at this point in time, just because of the way they responded to some constructive criticism. And that just alludes to your issue of behavior and being so careful when you're appointing people onto your board that you do some of these tests beyond reading a perfectly written CV and actually get to the person. Now, the reason this person got into the job, which is sort of around what you're saying, Stuart, is they interviewed brilliantly and the written CV was brilliant. I've interviewed the individual, and the individual does interview well when they are passing across the information that they have become prepared for and are in control of the moment of sharing. When put into the position of a conversation, a person can't do it. Just can't do it. Just impossible. So you do need to make sure in interview processes that you create some way of getting underneath the skin of somebody's external persona. And it's like buying a house. You don't go and check that it hasn't got iron piping hiding under the floorboards. You can't. It is a very, very difficult process. You don't have a chance to build a relationship and then make a decision. You have to go through some forms of testing, enough contact with the individual to try and recognize signs as to whether there's a red alert on that one or not. The other one that is always difficult is a personal agenda. I want to get to the top at any cost. I want the most amount of money at any cost. I will be lazy. Doesn't matter how hard you push me. I will always leave at 4:30. Doesn't matter what else happens in the world. I mean, it can come to the end. COVID can happen, but I will leave at 4:30. All these cultural things will manifest as a result of one or two people doing these kind of things. And you learn which person you can find at lunchtime and which person you can find at 6 o'clock in the evening. You get to know these things. You know how people work. That is them that you're dealing with and the culture that they create around that. Anybody else? Yes, Susan?
Just thinking of the dynamics of all the different personalities in a boardroom, on a board. it must be extremely difficult when you can identify the different personalities that they don't fit those positions.
Yeah.
Actually reshuffle them. It must be extremely difficult. You've obviously done that.
Done that in a couple of circumstances, and in an environment recently that was handled with an organization was absolutely laying it down, the accountability of everyone in this environment. And your accountability is to do A, B, and C. This is the goal of what we have to achieve. This is our 1-year plan, 5-year plan. And this is what we've got to do, which means us as a small group have got to deliver this. If you're not up for it, you have got a window of the next 2 weeks to come back and say you can't do it. And interestingly enough, in that circumstance, when done and challenged hard enough, 2 will have taken the opportunity to step up and say, this place is not for me. So in other words, having all the kudos, being on the board, or being seen to be important, actually now suddenly meant work in this particular case. Now that might mean you've got KPIs, might be the example, but in this case, it was a stretched target for 5 years. Are you in for it? Or if you're going to waste the chairman's time, can we sort that out now? And you've got a grace period just to comfortably resign, and everybody will understand and respect you for doing the right thing. So that's one way of approaching it. The other one is actually to do some form of technical, insightful, academic, statistical testing of some nature. The other one is to bring in an external viewpoint that can challenge the way that the people are behaving. And as an external can say, this is what the mirror looks like. I know it's not as attractive as you thought, but here's how we can make it look like you want it to. So it's trying to give them the objective input, but also the journey. Now, culture is not an easy one to change. It doesn't. I mean, to change the boardroom dynamic, which is an outcome of culture, we say it needs at least 2 people on the board to change, to create a definitive change, other than if you're talking about the chairman. So outside of chairman, if you're looking at the non-execs and you're thinking my non-exec group is not as efficient as it should be, you need at least 2 changes on the average size board to kick that momentum around. 1 person comes in and adapts. 2 people come around and say, really? Why? And you can get change to be incentivized that way. So quite often if we have to work with a board that needs to go through some degree of more dramatic change, we will say do 2 and balloon the board. We can't balloon the board. We can't have that many directors. I said, you'd be amazed how many left hooks you get that cause a diminishing in your board numbers. There's no harm in having 1 more than you need, because that one of them are going to go. Someone's going to go before you plan. I've just written a 10-year succession plan for a board to get it from being a totally non-independent board to a totally independent board, and to take out all the legacy and the current structure. And because the stakeholders say, no, we can't do this, we can't take step 1. So if you don't take step 1, you're never going to get to step 10. So I've had to map 10 years out for them to say, if you take step 1, that is where you're going to be able to get to. So it's important that we slice the decisions down into something people can find palatable. So that's another way of saying we can't change culture, but we can change 1 step. And the ultimate will be, and every year we will be thrown a left hook. Somebody will resign, somebody will get sick, merger or an acquisition, new business takeover, industry changes, COVID comes. Anything can still happen, and that plan will be different. But at least you can get people to see the journey.
I don't know if it's relevant to this, but I've been chairman of 2 companies in China, and I found that the most difficult experience from a culture point of view, especially when we're listed, to get them to understand how companies run here and people run it. They they thought they could have the best of both worlds, running as a private company still in China, but having the trappings of a public company here, become a billionaire overnight. And to explain that and to get them to understand that, it was one of the most difficult tasks I've done. But fortunately for me, I managed, and none of my companies had any problems on the market, but still it was very, very difficult.
It is extremely difficult. We've had a comment from Rupert, who's just dropped off, saying, plenty of experience of the change chairman, completely unsettling the board and the company, going from consensus to bullying and looking forward to the next session. Okay, I wasn't meant to read that bit out. But I have seen an organization whose culture within the company was that of a CEO bully, who literally bullied all the executive management and the next level down. The board were oblivious to it completely for years and years and years. And eventually the chief operating officer, who by now was a board director, eventually brought it to the board's attention. And various people had started to talk when they'd seen a board member in a private environment where they were able to speak. They said, look, we really need to do something. There's massive bullying going on here. Chairman would not do anything about it. Wouldn't do anything. Eventually he got bullied into doing certain things, but it was very limited, and the journey will take until his retirement to properly address the culture in that organization. Because in his environment, you don't fire a CEO. You don't make those kind of difficult decisions. You live with what you've got and you tolerate what you have. And the correlation between that and the bottom line, a lot of executives, board members, don't get that correlation. A dangerous one not to get. There was if you have a look at financial services has gone through that whole culture renaissance of saying, we're not about the bottom line. It's not about the way investment banking behaves. It's about our stakeholders. And I was working with an insurance company where everything was about the bottom line. Everything, that CEO had a 5-year plan. His 5-year plan was to make that at any cost. And that was nervous breakdowns, staff resignations, high staff churn, all sorts of things that were going on in this organization that the board weren't even recognizing. When I made a comment about it, they were absolutely complete and utter disbelief. They did, in this case, take cognizance of the kind of character, and within this global organization found a role where his type, what he'd just achieved, found another part of the organization that needed that 5-year at all costs to get itself out of where it was, and sensibly moved him. Instead of trying to get him to deliver on the next 5-year plan, which was a completely different mindset of retain, manage, consolidate, this guy would have completely got it. So they were sensible. They actually did do something about it and did move him. There's actually been another question that's come up on the chat line. Do you think there's merit in having formal EQ training for the board, and how do you think that would be received? I think it's a brilliant idea. EQ is the one thing one can learn, and it's not like IQ, so it is definitely good. I did come across a guy who was well trained, having come up through the US McKinsey style professional consultancy kind of individual. And he'd obviously been taught EQ, wasn't in his DNA. And I would say it didn't wash true when you spoke to him, but you're too nice, you're too pushy, you're too, I'm not so sure this really washes by me. So it's to become aware, but not to become something you're not, and finding that balance. So I think that is important. And somebody else has just said goodbye, been on their way, and then we've
Sharon, I've got one question. It's Alan.
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah. Is this subject of culture becoming an acceptable thing to talk about in the boardroom? I mean, I can remember a time when it was soft and fluffy, and something, well, maybe the HR department would look after that, but it's not really mainstream.
I
Do you
think,
see any changes in that direction?
yeah, no, you've definitely seen changes because we talk about it in the public medium as well. So it definitely has improved hugely. It'll be more successful where culture is good, and it'll be less successful where culture is bad. And
So the old adage applies.
yeah, exactly, it
The
does.
most need for it
Are the ones that
want at
do
least.
at least. I think where your challenge is, Anne, is where the culture direction is coming from the person who needs to lead the change. So the chairman or the CEO. So if either of them are driving the wrong culture, you will really, really suffer to get that spoken about and fixed. An organization recently that I worked with, it was one individual, but did not hold either deputy chair, SID, or any or company secretary role. They were one of many NEDs. And there, everyone was able to talk about it and to deal with the impact one person was having on the culture, the debate, the quality of the conversation. And interesting enough, as humans, we all forgave the person, thought they would learn, give them space to improve, till eventually it all breaks down and everyone just says, no. It's past being fixable. That sounds very unfixable. It's past being able to be addressed. I've got to the stage where even if that person were to become completely different, I wouldn't trust it, and therefore it's not going to work on me. I'm not going to pull my team effort contribution to making that person still fit in. So there's nothing, and then it's off the edge. And very seldom do we see the opportunity to get that conversation had before it becomes too late, because people can't see it coming. It's only when it's got too late they look back and say, look how it's changed, look at what we used to do, and look at where we are now.
Yeah. In summing up, I'd just like to say that from my experience looking at companies that achieved its financial goals have always promoted a healthy corporate culture.
You say it always does.
Always has promoted a healthy corporate culture.
Companies
that achieved its financial goals.
I would question that.
Would
Did
you?
Barclays?
So would I. I'm afraid.
I would challenge that, Frank. I mean, I look at Barclays.
Yes.
I look at the example of the insurance company I've just given you. Achieving the financial KPIs is probably at most half the business. The other half is running a good business. And financial focus doesn't always give you the culture of inclusivity, of creativeness or entrepreneurialism. It just becomes at all costs. So it depends on where you're sitting on achieving the goals with all the other KPIs considered, then I will go with you.
Okay.
And all the other KPIs very strongly including your people metrics, your stakeholder metrics, the culture metrics, which is a difficult one to do metrics. I want to talk about that in our third session on how do we measure culture, which is, you can't damn well see it. How the hell are we going to measure it? But let's make a damn good effort at it. But thanks for the contention, Frank.
If I were to say promote has achieved its financial and business goals, if it promoted a healthy corporate culture, would you go with that?
Getting better.
Okay.
I still think that the need to be embracing of all aspects of the business metrics are so important. Daniel, I don't know if there's anything you want to add before we close, and Susan, I'm not sure if that was something you also wanted to add quickly. No? Okay. Guys, we call that a wrap at 45 minutes into the session. I hope you enjoyed it with us and look forward to seeing you on 2 more culture sessions that follow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.